Well, today we've gathered to talk about something that is not easy to talk about. It may be uncomfortable, confusing, but we need to talk about it like grown-ups. As we begin this adult conversation, we have a play. We're lucky to have a brand new playwright among us, Mr. Jim Johnson, a member of First Baptist Church of Greater Des Moines, who is debuting his new drama, Just for You, Someone Needs to Talk to David, starring Mr. Johnson and Dr. Linda Kreipel, a member of First Unitarian Des Moines.
Excellent dinner, George. The Brussels sprouts were amazing.
Well, thank you, dear. The secret is using a lot of fresh garlic. And a half pound of bacon doesn't hurt either.
You know, I don't understand people who don't like Brussels sprouts.
Speaking of sprouts, have you heard from our son lately?
Oh, you know, dear, if you want to talk to David, you have to call him. He's not going to call us. But I did happen to call him the other day, and I've been meaning to talk to you about that. I was just waiting for the right moment.
Why? What's wrong?
Oh, well, he was asking me some questions that made me a little uncomfortable as his mother. Questions about you know what. You did have that talk with him, didn't you? From what he was asking me, I got the feeling that he doesn't have a clue about how things work.
Of course I had to talk with them, kind of.
Oh, kind of? Really, George, you either did or you didn't.
Well, I guess when it goes right down to it, I didn't. You know, it's hard for a man to talk to some things about with his son. For gosh sakes, Martha, the boy is 27 years old. You'd think he would have picked up something from his friends by now. That's pretty much how I learned.
Well, it's not like you're any expert on the subject. And his friends? Have you met his friends?
All right already. I'll call him tomorrow.
Oh, no, not tomorrow, mister. You'll call him right now. Otherwise, you'll come up with some excuse not to call him tomorrow. Now, since you cooked, I'll clear the dishes while you call David.
I'm calling him right now, dear. Hello, son. How are things going? Oh, that's good. Well, to be perfectly honest, son, I'm calling to talk to you because your mother said you wanted to talk about a delicate subject. Well, maybe I can help. I've still got a few tricks up my sleeve. What is it you want to know about taxes?
It's not an easy conversation to have. Taxes. It's uncomfortable, it's confusing, and sometimes it makes us angry. But we believe that it's a conversation that we need to have, and here's why. Here's one of the reasons we're here, and this is one of the reasons that I'm here. In March, there was a local option sales tax referendum on the ballot in Polk County. At first, I was immediately against raising sales taxes. Then I thought about it. Why was I against it? Then I was given an opportunity to meet with a former city council person, then with the mayor and the city manager, and I found out how local municipalities in Iowa fund their government. Who knew? I found out that this local option sales tax had the potential to address an issue that had been annoying me and those who live in the Cheatham Park neighborhood where St. Paul AME Church is located. The city manager and the mayor shared that part of the revenue would go to a program called a Blitz on Blight that might address the deteriorating housing stock in our community, and in particular, the houses that you see on the screen. They have been like that since my appointment to St. Paul more than a decade ago. As a result of that meeting, Amos went to work to get a better understanding of how confusing and convoluted and challenging the tax system is here in Iowa. But once I understood the situation and the opportunity for our city, I went from being a staunch opponent to a strong proponent. I also learned that the actions on one level of government can have a great impact on the ability of another level of government to fulfill its mission. And as citizens, we need to try. No, we must learn to understand it. And that's why I'm here.
I'm here because I'm tired of being told there's not enough money for my kids' education, for mental health care resources, for my church members, for affordable housing for my community. I want to know why there is no money for the things that my family and the families I work with every week need. Several times last year, AMOS leaders went to the Capitol to talk to our legislators about changing the mental health and disabilities tax levy. This levy has been frozen in time since 1996 at $116 million. Since I was 16, that's all this state has collected to fund mental health resources, $116 million. And we thought that was ridiculous, that it should be changed and local communities should be able to change their tax levy if they needed to. Everywhere we turn, we are told, well, people are taxed enough. No one wants to raise their taxes. Well, you know what? If it came down to my family members, my neighbors, my church members being able to access life-changing, life-saving services that they desperately needed, then I was willing to raise my taxes if it saved lives. Today we're going to go deeper in this tax conversation. For over 4 months, a team of AMOS leaders have been studying the Iowa state budget. We've talked to policy experts on both sides of the aisle. We talked to researchers, public officials on a quest to know where our tax dollars go, asking the question, who pays and who benefits? And we want to have that grown-up, reasonable conversation about taxes, because too often things are polarized and partisan, and we take ourselves out of the equation and let the experts decide. Well, today we've decided we want to become the experts. In a moment, our AMOS tax team and their newly minted experts will come forward to share what we've learned so far. After that, we're going to break into house meetings and continue that conversation. And after that, we'll come back in here and meet with our public officials and candidates. Our goal is to leave today more informed, more equipped, and more organized to do the work that AMOS is called to do.
Welcome. Matt and I have been part of a larger tax team that has been looking at data and reports published by the state government, as well as going out to talk to key individuals in state government, and we have learned a lot. Our research journey certainly continues, but we'd like to share with you some of the things that we've learned so far. So our roadmap for our discussion is that we are going to start by talking about some tax policy evaluation principles. Then we will speak a little bit about the impact of the recently signed 2018 Iowa tax cuts. And then lastly, we'll address a few special topics. So to get us started, we'll talk about those principles. The National Conference of State Legislators has put together a handbook, or a manual, if you will, that they give to brand new state legislators. And these 6 principles are intended to guide legislators as they craft tax policy. Due to time constraints, we're not going to go through all of them today. There is a link on the slides that you could go out and read the full document if you like. We'll talk about the first 2, reliability and equity. And reliability is broken down into 3 subcomponents. If you look at things from the state government's point of view, stability is really getting at the point that they really need to have a consistent, reliable, predictable source of revenue so that they can budget and plan ahead for the future. Certainty is similar, but it's looking at things from the taxpayer's perspective. So tax policy should not change so quickly and radically that businesses and individuals can't plan ahead for their own budgeting purposes. And then sufficiency is getting at the idea that you just need to have enough revenue coming in so that you can pay for your obligations. So what we'd like to do is take a look at some revenue and appropriation information for the state of Iowa, looking at it through this lens of reliability. And so I know for those of you in the back, this screen is probably somewhat difficult to read, but what it's showing us is a pie chart of Iowa's general fund revenue, and we're looking here specifically at fiscal year 2017. And so I personally was pretty surprised when I saw this. I knew what our sources of revenue were, or kind of the different pots of money where things were coming from, but I didn't really know how it broke down in terms of proportion. So on the right-hand side of the screen, in blue, we have the revenue coming from personal income tax, and that's a little bit over 50% of the revenue. The next biggest component is in red, and that's coming from sales and use tax. And then up towards the top of the screen in green, we have corporate income tax, which is about 6%. And then we have a few other categories that finish out our pie. So I was a little surprised to see how things are proportioned, personally. This chart is also showing general fund revenue, but it's looking at it over a span of years. So it starts in 1994 on the left, and it continues through 2018. So in green, we're seeing that individual income tax again. In kind of the red jagged line that's below that, that's the sales and use tax. And then down at the bottom, there's a black jagged line that's showing you corporate income tax. And then we have the other areas. So you can see individual income tax has always been the biggest part of the pie. But this is another chart that surprised me because over time, I did not realize the gap was widening out so much, and that increasingly we are relying on individual income taxes for more and more of the money. So going back to our principle of reliability, if you look at the gray bars that are coming down from the top of the screen, that is showing the recessionary periods that we've had in recent years. And you can see that during a recession, well, we all know what happens, our incomes drop. And so we see that the individual income tax revenue during the recessionary periods was either flat or it dropped. So this is violating that stability principle because it's really hard for state government to plan ahead when they're primarily relying on individual income tax because it's just not a very stable source of revenue. Because anytime you have a recessionary period, it's going to drop, and just over time it fluctuates a lot. It's not terribly constant. And then that in turn leads to some sufficiency problems because if you end up bringing in less money than you were anticipating, you can't fund all of your budgetary priorities. So coming back to fiscal year 2017, we've talked about the revenue sources, and this is how the money was appropriated. So at the bottom of our pie chart in green, school aid is the biggest portion of the appropriation pie. So that's around 42%. The next largest portion is Medicaid, which is in red. And then over on the left, we have the Department of Corrections and higher education. And then the orange piece is property tax replacement. That's 6.7% at about $476 million. And I just want you to file that away in your memory bank for a minute because I'm going to come back to that on the next slide. So I know this is a lot of charts. Hang in there with me. Okay, so this chart shows the general fund surplus over about a 10-year period. And in 2009, we were in a recession, and we hit $0 for our surplus. I don't think anyone would be surprised by that. When you're in a recession, you would expect that. So coming out of the recession, the surplus rebuilt itself pretty quickly. We got up to around $927 million in 2013. And then you can see it swiftly dropped back down again. So within three and a half years, it was depleted, and both in fiscal year 17 and again this fiscal year, we ended up having to have some mid-year cuts. So what accounts for that drop? There are a couple of factors. One thing that influences that is when the tax system at the federal level changes, any federal tax modifications will have a ripple down effect and they're going to impact state taxation as well. But the most significant factor in this is that in 2013, the legislature enacted a commercial property tax break. And so that meant that local governments were going to be bringing in less revenue because they were going to miss out on those commercial property tax revenue sources. So to help make up the difference, the state legislature decided to start giving local governments property tax backfill money, and I'm sure you've all heard that phrase in the news. So on the previous screen where we saw that orange slice of the pie, we were talking about that backfill money. And what's happened is every year, the amount of money it takes to provide the backfill money is getting bigger and bigger, and it's taking up more appropriations than I think were originally anticipated. And so that is the most significant reason in why the surplus has just disappeared. Okay, coming back to one other tax policy principle, we'd also like to mention equity. And equity is getting at the idea of fairness. And of course, everyone in this room probably has a different idea of what is fair when it comes to taxation. But just so we're sort of all working with the same terminology, there is horizontal equity, which means two people who are making the same income really ought to be taxed the same. They ought to be similarly situated people should be treated the same. Vertical equity gets at the idea of how the tax burden ought to be distributed between people with different income levels. And so when we talk about vertical equity, that's when the concepts of progressive, regressive, and proportional taxation come into play. In a progressive tax system, more of the tax burden falls on high income folks. In a regressive tax system, more of the burden falls on low income folks. And then in a truly proportional system, that's where you would have a flat tax that impacts everyone the same.
Rebecca. We're going to go in now and talk a little bit more about Iowa's taxes, specifically the 2018 tax cut that were just signed into law. I believe it was Wednesday they signed that. Before we get into that too much, we want to talk a little bit about federal deductibility because that's kind of a key concept in the way our state taxes people. When you go to do your state taxes, you are allowed to deduct from your income the amount you paid in federal taxes for that year. And Iowa is one of only 3 states that do that, Alabama and Louisiana, the other 2. And it sets up an inverse relationship between the state taxes and the federal taxes. So when your federal taxes go up, that means your state deduction goes up, and therefore your state taxes will go down. As your federal taxes, if they should go down, which they are for this current tax year, then your state deduction goes down and your state taxes would go up. And so that state legislature decided that was not something they wanted to see persist. They went ahead and made some adjustments to the rates in response somewhat to the federal tax cuts that have just been promulgated. So we're going to get into that just a little bit more here. They're doing this in 2 phases. Phase 1 is just a modest reduction in the personal income tax rates, and it's keeping the federal deductibility in place. You may have heard that they were eliminating federal deductibility. They may or they may not in phase 2. And again, this phase 1 is just kind of to address the as a response to what they're doing at the federal level that otherwise would drive up Iowa taxes. They're driving them back down. They've actually overshot the mark a little bit, and we'll get into the revenue numbers here in just a minute, but they're actually driving them not only back down to where they would have otherwise been absent any federal tax changes, but then a little bit lower yet from there. Phase 2, they were concerned a little bit about sufficiency. If we get back to our principles, there was, Kansas lowered their income tax rates dramatically, and they've had a lot of problem funding their services. So the legislature, at least, they're publicly saying that they don't want to go that same route as Kansas. So they've set up a phase 2, which is a much further reduction in rates, a simplification of the number of brackets, and elimination of federal deductibility at the personal level, only if these 2 triggers are hit. And they can be hit as early as 2023, where the revenue from the previous year has to be at least $8.3 billion, and that $8.3 billion has to represent a growth of 4% over the preceding year. So that violates, in some ways, for a taxpayer's standpoint, it violates the certainty principle that we talked about, because you don't know if you're going to get a tax cut or not. And it may be in 2023, it may be later than that, If we don't get the triggers in 2023, we wait till 2024 and see if we get them, or 2025. And they just keep waiting until we get the $8.3 billion in revenue and 4% growth over the previous year. Once we hit those triggers, then this phase 2 tax cut comes in, and your taxes will go down, the state revenues will go down. And this is permanent. Once the triggers are hit, there's no going back unless some future legislature and governor decide to raise taxes from that point forward. So once we hit that, the revenues will most likely go down, and we need legislation to raise them back up if we find that it is not sufficient and we're having to make drastic cuts across state government. So this is still phase 1 numbers right here, 2021. I know most of you can't probably read this at the back, so we'll just kind of give you some of the highlights on this. But you'll notice, I don't know if you can see the pointer, that for the middle income taxpayers, you're going to save, just on the phase 1, just a couple $100s a year in taxes. When you get over $500,000, $1 million of income, it's thousands of dollars saved. And that makes, in some ways, that you probably would expect that because people who have the most are paying the most. But you'll take a look at the rates, it's, the percentage savings for those at the bottom is only 3%. In the middle incomes, you're looking at about a 7 or 8% cut. And those at the top, $500,000 and more, are getting not only more in absolute dollars, but they're getting a 20% cut in their taxes. And this chart doesn't have, we didn't put every line on here because it's hard enough to read as it is, so there's a few rows missing, but we put totals for each of the rows we have, and then the grand total down here as far as what the lost revenue is projected to be in 2021. We're looking at $442 million. So, and that's calculated, these numbers here, I'll give you a little background on how these are calculated. The LSA put these numbers together. They basically assume the same growth in the economy regardless of what the tax policies are. Those who are supporting this legislation will claim that as you cut taxes, the economy will grow and you will actually make up some revenue from what the base case is. The base case is if we didn't change any policies, economy grows at 3.5%, 4%, what do we have now? Same 3.5%, 4% growth, what we have under the new tax law. That's kind of the comparison we've got here. Their claim is that if we cut the taxes, the economy will grow, we'll make up a lot of that revenue. There also needs to be considered as well that there is a stimulative effect of government spending. If revenues do drop, teachers maybe not getting raises, getting laid off, etc. So the dynamic scoring is what they call it. It gets very complicated very quickly. They didn't go that route in calculating these numbers, so there is some disagreement over whether those was accurate or not. Also, some of the lost revenue is being made up for by additional sales and use taxes, some of which they may or may not be able to collect. There is some legislation and some court cases pending at the federal level that will decide whether or not the states are allowed to collect sales taxes on, say, things that are purchased out of from online from out-of-state company. They don't collect sales tax. Now, in the current law, you're supposed to report that to the state and pay it yourself as a use tax. Nobody does that. Nobody even keeps track of that. Most people don't even know they're supposed to. So there is some backfill or some additional revenue that's going to be making up some of these losses from the sales of these taxes. Special topics, we'll get into some of those. The first one we're going to talk about is the corporate tax rate. Under the old law, the Iowa's tax rate for corporations was 12%, which was the highest in the country. But they also get to deduct half of their federal tax liability when they do their taxes. There's also a lot of other deductions, credits, etc., that tend to bring the effective rate down quite a bit. So if we get rid of the federal deductibility and you can lower the tax rate, and that's what they've done here. We're going to explore this in a little bit more detail. The 12% rate, the top rate is coming down to 9.8% in 2019, and federal deductibility has been eliminated for corporations, and that's for sure. Where personal income tax payers don't have a lot of certainty on phase 2 whether they're going to get it or not. Corporations do, in fact, have certainty. They are getting their federal deductibility eliminated. They're getting these new rates, and those are permanent. Now, the federal, so when you lower that, we've been told that people that looked at that 12% and were reluctant to locate their businesses in Iowa because of that. But as we noted with the deductibility and credit stuff, it gets very complicated very quickly on corporate taxes. For one thing, the example LSA gave us is only income originating in Iowa is subject to tax. So the example they gave us was a corporation that manufactures widgets. They're all sold in China. All that income is sourced from China, therefore they don't owe anything on that in Iowa. Their effective rate would be 0. If a company like Hy-Vee that sells most of their goods to other Iowans, that's all Iowa sourced income, they might be closer to the 10 or 12%. Also, we don't have time to do an accounting class here, but GAAP accounting allows them to spread their profits and losses over multiple years. So they can adjust their accounting, adjust their bookkeeping, all legally, perfectly legally, to try and minimize their tax burdens. And Rebecca's going to talk a minute about some of the tax credit issues that we have here in Iowa. So there's other ways they can lower their tax burden. And it just is a very, very complicated setup. So Ernst & Young put together some numbers across the country here to try and figure out what are corporations actually paying. What do their rates look like? So yeah, our top rate at the time they did this was 12%. But what they did here was they took the amount of sum total of corporate taxes that all the corporations in the state pay, divided it by the state's domestic product, the size of the state's economy, and tried to just compare those ratios across the country. You can see Iowa, we're right about in the middle as far as what corporations actually pay as a proportion of Iowa's economy. You know, Maine, Vermont, North Dakota, they're higher, Missouri's lower, so we're kind of right, even before this tax law change, we were right about in the middle. So that 12%, even though some corporations might look at it and be scared off, it's not what they end up actually paying.
Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about tax credits in Iowa. It's important to understand the distinction between non-refundable and refundable credits. Non-refundable credits will lower your tax liability, possibly even down to the point where you owe $0 in state taxes. A non-refundable tax credit also brings down your tax liability, but even once you've hit $0, you can go even further. So you could be paying no income tax and still get a check back from the state. And we're just going to focus on one tax credit today because of time constraints again, and that's the research activities credit. This is the most significant tax credit that businesses in Iowa receive. It is a refundable tax credit, so theoretically there can be a corporation paying $0 in taxes and they could still get money back from the state for research activities. In 2017, there were just over $48 million distributed in refunds through this tax credit, and we tend to see the same businesses kind of at the top end of the recipient list year after year. So a few of them are listed here. These are the top 5 from 2017. So the top one was Rockwell Collins, coming in at just under $14 million. A few other talking points we wanted to address, and this is kind of taxes more broadly, not Iowa specific, but we often hear that 45% of Americans don't pay taxes. The actual percentage kind of varies from year to year, but we wanted to know, is this true? So we did a little looking around, and is this true? Yes and no. So there's a little bit more nuance to it. So it is true that around 45% of Americans do not pay federal income taxes. So that's a pretty substantial percentage. Why is that the case? So for most of them, it's because their income level isn't high enough to incur any kind of federal income tax liability, or through credits and deductions, their tax liability is brought down to 0, so they don't owe anything. But even for those who are not paying federal income taxes, if they're employed, they are paying other kind of federal taxes. So they would be paying, most notably, the payroll taxes that go to support Social Security and Medicare. And then many of them are also still paying state income taxes. I also want to mention that coming up with this percentage is not an exact science. It sort of depends upon how you're defining and counting things. So for example, one of the articles that I read indicated that even if someone has a job and they're having federal income taxes automatically deducted from their paycheck, if they fail to file a tax return at the end of the year, they are not counted as a federal income taxpayer, even though the taxes have been coming out. So it's not an exact science. We also hear that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes but are taking advantage of government services. So this is something else we looked into a little bit. So the U.S. Chamber of Commerce estimates that just over half of undocumented immigrants are actually working on the books, So they have some kind of falsified paperwork that they use to get a job. And so they are having federal income taxes come out of their paycheck automatically. They're also having those payroll taxes taken out, even though they'll never benefit from Medicare or Social Security. And then they're also paying other kinds of taxes as listed on the screen. And so it's estimated, this is a number from 2013, but in that year it's estimated that they paid about $11.6 billion in state and local taxes.
The last special topic we're going to talk about is the Revenue Estimating Conference. This is a panel of 3 people that is charged with estimating future revenues for the state that the legislature and governor are legally bound to use when they set their budget for the year. This is a significant improvement over what we had in the past. The governor, in the early 80s, the governor would have a number, the House might have a number, the Senate might have a number, the Department of Revenue might have a number. All kinds of different people had their opinion of what the revenue was going to be in the next fiscal year, and it was kind of chaos. So when they did the big government reorganization bill in the mid-80s, they set up this committee of 3 people. There is a representative of the governor, who is currently the director of the Department of Management, that's Dave Roederer. The legislature has a representative, that's currently Holly Lyons, who runs the Fiscal Services Division for the LSA, which is the Legislative Services Agency. And then those 2 people, the governor's representative and the legislature's representative, mutually agree on a 3rd private sector person to sit on the committee. That is currently David Underwood, a retired businessman from Mason City. So these 3 people sit down, they meet at least 3 times a year. In December, the number they've come up with is the one that has to be used for the setting of the budget in the upcoming legislative session. So when they set a number here this past December 2017, that was for the fiscal year 2019 budget that starts in a month from now on July 1st and runs through June 30th of 2019. So that's 18 months in advance of when the estimate is set. So when they were setting an estimate this past December, that was for 18 months into the future. And that's not an easy thing to estimate, what revenues are going to be 18 months in the future. They have some various inputs they use. They have some hard revenue, or some hard data from the Department of Revenue with regard to amount of tax receipts coming in, refunds going out, sales taxes, all that kind of stuff. The hard numbers they can quantify very precisely. And then some far less precise things. Moody's business forecasts, weather forecasts that might affect crop yields both here and in places like Brazil. Trade issues, international tensions, federal tax law changes, the Federal Reserve, what they're going to do with interest rates. All that stuff kind of gets baked into the forecast as far as what the revenue is going to be. Of course, we all know the weather forecast can't necessarily be trusted for tomorrow, let alone 18 months from now. So this thing is subject to a lot of error, and Holly Lyons basically told us this thing is almost guaranteed to be wrong based on what they're trying to do and how they're trying to do it. And you can see this chart here shows you where the actual revenues finally came in relative to the forecast. So some of these you see the revenues came in far below forecast. Some years the revenue actually comes in higher than the forecast. But again, this speaks to the fact that every single year it's going to be wrong. When it's wrong, when they miss low, when the actual revenue comes in below what the estimate had been, that's when you start to hear some crisis calls out of the legislature where they say, what are we going to do? We're coming in 60 million short, 100 million short. What are we going to do about that? Some years they make cuts, some years they take things out of the rainy day fund, some years it's a combination of both. And Dave Roeder and Holly Lyons are both very kind and generous to sit down with their time and talk to us about this. We asked them, are there any ways we can improve this system? Holly Lyons from LSA said, well, you know, if we had a larger staff, we might be able to pull more data in and get a better estimate that way. Dave Roeder said, you're trying to model human behavior, and there's no real good way to do that. So until you can model human behavior perfectly, we're not going to get these numbers quite right. You can see they miss almost every year, sometimes high, sometimes low, but you know, they're right about in the middle on average, so that's not too bad actually. And you know, we asked that, one other thing they know is that it's been talking about maybe putting more people on the committee, getting more inputs. The concern there would be that it would become even more political. When you have more and more people sitting on the committee, you get more politics as to who's on, who's off. And probably this is about the best we're going to do with these 3 people, you know, doing the best they can with the data they've got, and on average doing a pretty good job. So just when the years they're low, that's a problem. So Future study topics, we want to look a lot more in depth at the tax credit exemptions. The legislature itself has put together a committee to try and study that. So alternative tax structures, we want to look at those. Local taxes and school funding, those are again 2 separate systems for how things are funded. So if you have any interest in this, if this has piqued your interest, we'd love to have you on the team.